Good day. Today is Thursday, 24th April 2025. We are a day from the collapse of the negotiations, the discussions in London, where the collective West, the United States, the Europeans, and the Ukrainians were supposed to all unite in support of Kellogg's peace plan. As I discussed in my previous video, on Tuesday, President Zelensky made an extraordinary speech in which he rejected the Kellogg peace plan in its entirety. Every single part of it. He said that he was not prepared, and Ukraine was not prepared, to enter into negotiations on any of the final issues, any of the settlement issues in the conflict, as the Russians have repeatedly insisted. He wants an unconditional, indefinite ceasefire. Then and only then can negotiations begin, with no date as to the end of these negotiations and no indication as to the outcome of the negotiations, except, of course, that he will continue to insist on his own peace plan. Well, he didn't say this, but that's clearly what he means, a peace plan whereby every millimeter of Ukrainian territory, including Crimea, or what he says is Ukrainian territory, should be returned to Ukraine. The Russians should in effect capitulate, that the Russians should then enter into negotiations about paying reparations and war crimes trials and all of that kind of thing. As I said, that was the speech that Zelensky made yesterday. He rejected outright Kellogg's peace plan. Now, prior to Zelensky's speech, prior to the meeting in London, the United States, the US Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, Kellogg himself, Witkoff also, and Donald Trump in various comments, all of them had said that this was essentially a make or break moment. If a peace deal could not be agreed within the next few days, the point would have come when the United States would finally walk away from the conflict, that it had many other priorities and concerns, but that it could not continue to waste time and resources supporting a conflict where there was no clear end point and no satisfactory outcome. That was what Rubio said, that was what Witkoff said, that was what Kellogg said, that was what Donald Trump said. And after Zelensky's speech on Tuesday, after the breakup and collapse of the talks on Wednesday, with no endorsement of Kellogg's peace plan, the moment one might have expected had finally been reached, when the United States would act on what the president himself and his senior officials had said and finally walk away from the discussions. Well, I said in my program yesterday and in previous programs that I doubted that would be the case. And in fact, over the following hours, we started to get comments from Donald Trump himself, which shows that far from walking away from the peace plan, from the peace negotiations, from the war, he continues to try to find some kind of elusive settlement to the war. He published a truly remarkable comment on Truth Social. I'm not going to read it in its entirety, but it begins with these words. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky is boasting on the front page of the Wall Street Journal that Ukraine will not legally recognize the occupation of Crimea. There's nothing to talk about here. This statement is very harmful to the peace negotiations with Russia. So, Trump is signaling here that the negotiations, despite the outright rejection of the Kellogg plan by the Ukrainians, the peace negotiations are going to continue in some way. It's unclear to me, completely unclear to me, in what way exactly, but that apparently is what Donald Trump is saying. He's still clinging on to the idea that negotiations of some kind are going to lead to an outcome. He's nowhere in this True Social post repeats warnings about this having to come to an end over the next having to be resolved at some point over the next few days or this month. He still talks about negotiations, and he still appears to think that negotiations can still achieve some kind of a deal, some kind of agreement to end the war, which remains apparently his objective. And then a few hours after he published this post on Truth Social, Trump followed up with a further post on Truth Social in which he criticized the Russians for conducting a big combined missile and drone strike across Ukraine focused on Kiev. He said that this too was unhelpful in light of the negotiations that are supposedly still taking place. So all of those statements, all of those comments made a couple of days ago about the United States being prepared or on the brink of walking away from the entire negotiating process, well, they've all been set aside apparently, and exactly as I feared, we're going to see this endless process of negotiations continue, apparently in the same chaotic, sporadic, incoherent way that we have seen happen previously. Now, I should say that over the last couple of hours, presumably in expectation, in anticipation of Witkoff's visit to Moscow tomorrow and his meeting with Putin, the Russians have been making completely clear that their positions remain the same as always. So Dmitry Peskov, Putin's spokesman, gave a massive interview to the French newspaper Le Point, and this is what he said about the four regions. He said, if Ukraine withdraws its troops from these four regions, then yes, there can be a ceasefire. And he then went on to say that the regions are enshrined in the Russian constitution as an integral part of Russia. He noted that at the moment some territories of these regions are still occupied by the Kiev regime. According to the results of the referendums, these territories have entered the administrative borders of Russia. From our point of view, this is a de jure and de facto situation. Now, a couple of days ago, there was an article in the Financial Times which spoke about Putin having supposedly told Witkoff at their last meeting in St. Petersburg that the Russians were prepared to allow the Ukrainians to remain in control of those parts of the four regions which the Russians have not so far captured or recaptured. Well, this interview by Peskov to Le Point straightforwardly contradicts that claim. Here we have Peskov himself. He'd previously said that the comment, the article he'd basically insinuated that the article in the Financial Times was fake news. He's gone ahead. He's now said that the Russian demand that Ukraine withdraw from the entirety of the four regions, which are part of Russia, both de jure and de facto. He makes it clear that that demand has not gone away, has not been conceded, and that there is no intention of conceding it. The regions are enshrined in the Russian constitution as an integral part of Russia. And he made it also clear that these territories have entered the administrative borders of Russia. That's what he says. That is what Peskov said. And of course, that's Peskov speaking, and he is, it's important to remember, Putin's spokesman. Putin then also told Le Point that Ukraine, if there's to be peace, needs a neutral status for Ukraine and the recognition of reality regarding the territories. The security of some countries should not be ensured behind the backs of others. If you want to guarantee Ukraine's security and involve it in NATO, you violate Russia's security. So the Russians are not willing to bend on the issue of NATO either. As we will see, some Western countries continue to insist that Ukraine should be allowed to enter NATO. And then Peskov also spoke about European peacekeepers. Now, yesterday, Valentina Matviyenko, or rather, the day before yesterday, Valentina Matviyenko, who is a member of Russia's Security Council and also who is the Speaker of the Russian Federation Council, the upper house of the Russian Parliament. Anyway, she said the deployment of European peacekeepers, so-called military contingents from Europe to Ukraine, was completely unacceptable. And Peskov has now followed up with that. And this, he said to reporters, as for the discussions on the deployment of military contingents on the territory of Ukraine, this is absolutely unacceptable for us. It carries a critical danger for the entire European and world security. And Sergei Shoigu, who is Putin's national security advisor, went even further, and he said that any deployment of peacekeepers to historical Russian lands would risk a third world war. And he said that in an interview to the official TASS news agency. Sensible politicians in Europe understand that the implementation of this scenario may lead to a direct confrontation between NATO and Russia, or even cause World War III down the road. The notion of peacekeepers conceals the pursuit of control over Ukraine and its mineral resources. It would be more correct to call such troops invaders or occupants, for these would be troops from NATO countries whose presence Russia opposed even prior to the special military operation. Besides, potential peacekeepers would support the current regime, persecution of Orthodox Christians, and the campaign to deprive the Russian-speaking population of Ukraine of the right to speak their native language and keep their culture and traditions. This would not be a peacekeeping mission, and obviously it is rejected. And he says that the real global majority has no inclination to join similar peacekeeping initiatives. So that was Shoigu. And then the Russian Foreign Ministry spokesman has also spoken, and she has said that the dialogue with the United States continues. There's nothing easy about it at this stage. Our countries are focused on finding long-term solutions. Our leaders have spoken about this. And then she drew attention to Putin's statements to the Foreign Ministry on the 14th of June 2024, in which of course he said that the four regions needed to be made in their entirety a part of Russia. This is not a position of demand, it is a basic position. The population of these regions has fully realized its right of self-determination enshrined in the UN Charter. Therefore, we should simply proceed from the realities, from territorial law, international law, from the situation on the ground. How long have we been encouraged to realize that everything should be decided on the ground? This is the point now. This is what we should proceed from. And so the Russians have gone out of their way over the last 24 hours to say that their position continues to be the same. as the one outlined by Putin when he spoke to the Foreign Ministry on the 14th of June 2024. That story in the Financial Times was clearly wrong. The Russians expect the entirety of the 4 regions to be transferred to Russia. They insist on neutral status for Ukraine, and they are not prepared to compromise on any of these things or on their demands about the rights of Russians in Ukraine and of the Russian Orthodox Church and those sort of things. So all of this clearly set out by the Russians in various statements they have made over the last 24 hours, clearly ahead of Zelensky's, not Zelensky's, obviously, Witkoff's visit to Moscow. Now, Professor Mearsheimer, who has looked at all of this, he has said that the Russian and Ukrainian positions are so far apart that there is simply no point of contact between them. It is absurd to go on pretending that there is, or that there is some kind of deal that can be done that can somehow reconcile the two. And we saw that when the Kellogg plan, which attempts to do that, was presented to Zelensky, he rejected it outright. These statements from the Russians make the same point in a sense. The Russians are far more diplomatic, far more careful in what they say than the Ukrainians are. We're not going to have the same kind of angry speech from Putin that we got from Zelensky. Putin is going to speak quietly, courteously with Witkoff. He's going to discuss it all in detail, presumably over many hours. But in substance, it's not going to be that different. He is going to tell Witkoff, Kellogg's plan simply won't work. It doesn't remotely address Russian demands. So Mearsheimer is obviously right. There is no bridge here that can be built between these demands of the Ukrainians and the demands of the Russians. The two are just too far apart from each other. Now, one person who does seem to have understood this is the US Secretary of State Marco Rubio. He apparently has said that the US, as a result of its dialogue with Russia conducted over the last few weeks, has developed a much better understanding of the Russian position about the war, but that the way the Ukrainians and the Russians talk about both the origins of the war and about its optimal outcome is so different that it's as if the two occupy entirely different zip codes. So that was what Rubio said. And again, the logic of that points to the absurdity of clinging on to this fiction that there can be a negotiated outcome to this conflict any longer. And, well, over the last 24 hours, something truly extraordinary for me has happened in terms of the stance of particular countries with respect to the negotiations. And this is the stance of the European states. Now, in my last two programs, I have said that I thought that even though the Europeans don't like the Kellogg plan at all, they basically support Ukraine's desire for an outright victory over the Russians. They never explain how that is to be achieved, but never mind. I thought that given the realities, given the position that the United States is taking, given the realities on the battlefronts, the Europeans nonetheless would grudgingly, very grudgingly, accept the Kellogg plan. Well, it turns out otherwise. It's absolutely clear over the last 24 hours that the Europeans are backing, again, Zelensky against Trump. We've had two articles about this, two articles in the Financial Times. There have been articles in all sorts of other places. But we read, for example, one article, Europe panics as US-Russia talks on Ukraine, race ahead without them. Let me say again, the Americans and the Russians are indeed speaking with each other. But as the Russians have repeatedly said, it's entirely open for the Europeans, if they wish, to establish their own dialogue with Moscow. The Russians have never said no. But anyway, for the moment, the Europeans are not speaking to Moscow. A couple of weeks ago, about 2 weeks ago, 3 weeks ago, there was a discussion at one of the endless meetings that the Europeans have been engaging in about appointing a representative, a European representative, to speak to the Russians. That was apparently proposed by the Spanish Prime Minister, Mr. Sanchez. He was immediately criticized by the EU's High Representative for Foreign Policy, Kaja Kallas, who basically said that if anybody should be in charge of negotiating and speaking to the Russians on behalf of Europe, that must be herself. An impossible position given her attitudes towards Russia. The idea that she's in any position to conduct negotiations with the Russians, given her biases and attitudes towards Russia, is absurd, as apparently Sanchez pointed out to her. Anyway, there was then a row. Then apparently some kind of consensus was reached that the Europeans would indeed appoint some kind of high representative, not Kallas, to represent their views in Moscow and to begin the dialogue with the Russians. Macron predictably proposed himself. Apparently there wasn't many takers for that particular idea. And since then we've heard nothing. There's been no appointment of any kind of representative from Europe to conduct dialogue with the Russians. There's been no attempt by the Europeans to reach out to the Russians. There's been no calls to Putin, no contacts with Lavrov. No one has gone to Moscow or met with Russian representatives in any other place. So that whole initiative appears to have come completely to nothing. So the Europeans continue to complain that they have been frozen out of the American-Russian discussions. But to repeat again, since they refuse to speak to the Russians themselves, the reality is that they themselves have frozen themselves out of the discussions. But anyway, there was apparently anger at the meeting on Wednesday when after Zelensky's extraordinary speech, Rubio and Witkoff decided that they would walk out of the meeting. We're told that the Europeans were furious about this. And then the Financial Times article goes on to say, as if to rub salt into the wounds, Witkoff is instead planning to fly to Moscow later this week for his fourth set of talks with Putin, the real negotiation table. And as I said, there was again absolute fury apparently about this. The Europeans complaining that they've been cut out of the discussions, even though they refuse to engage in the discussions. And then this article says that there was great anger about the fact that the Americans are now talking about Ukraine relinquishing claims to areas of the 4 regions that Russian troops have partially occupied in exchange for US recognizing Crimea as Russian. And then we're told that aside from the fact that it would violate Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity, European officials hate this proposal for 2 reasons. Firstly, it is a forced concession. Putin does not control the Ukrainian land he would be giving up, but his troops are occupying, gaining control of more and more of the land every single day. Maybe slowly, but who knows, before long, quickly. And then we go on to read, secondly, they fear that Trump's desire to strike a peace deal as soon as possible means he would force this arrangement and likely other demands from Moscow upon Kiev. You can't give up something you don't have, said one European diplomat. This is just to trick the Americans into doing a deal. And we're then told US recognition of Crimea would spark a major diplomatic crisis for the EU and even more so for NATO, whose current policy states the Allies do not and will not ever recognize Russia's illegal and illegitimate annexations, including of Crimea. Well, that was one article. Then a subsequent article appeared in the Financial Times, which actually went still further in telling us the extent to which the Europeans are furious with what the Americans are proposing. Trump's move on Russia-occupied Crimea forces Europe to choose sides. And in fact, if we go on to read, we learn that in practice, they've chosen sides. The sides that have been talked about are Trump versus Zelensky, America versus Ukraine, and predictably, they are choosing Zelensky and Ukraine against the United States. And we're told that Washington's offer to endorse Moscow's control of Crimea, breaking with the agreed policy of NATO, is possibly the biggest concession it has made to Moscow in recent months in its haste to strike a deal. A close ally of German Chancellor-to-be Friedrich Merz said late on Wednesday that Europe could not accept the proposal. I mean, it could not accept the United States making its own sovereign decision to recognize a part of territory which Russia occupies as Russian. I mean, anyway, it then goes on to say, Putin. This is the senior ally of Friedrich Merz, who was then revealed to be Thorsten Frey, a senior MP within the centre-right Christian Democrat Party. Putin would achieve all his goals, and the message that would be sent out would be, I can afford such aggression, I will prevail in the end and achieve my goals. And that means, if you look at the tradition in which Putin sees himself, that he will continue. What tradition is that exactly? And then we also read that the Trump administration, this is the Financial Times article, has also ruled out Ukraine's membership of NATO. And we then are told that the worst case, this is a senior EU diplomat says, the worst case would be if the United States cannot reach a deal between Ukraine and Russia, and this is all pushed on Ukraine. This is when Europe would have to choose between Ukraine and the United States. And of course, as I said, at least the European leaders, the leadership class in Europe, in that situation, have made it already clear that they're going to side with Ukraine against the United States. And then we're told that EU Foreign Policy Chief Kaja Kallas has said Crimea is Ukraine, and she said this to the French news agency Agence France Presse. And we're told that for Europeans, the idea of recognizing Crimea's annexation, the first land grab by military force in Europe since 1945, that is not true, by the way. In Cyprus, as I've pointed out many times, as my colleague and friend Alex Christoforou has also pointed out many, many times, there was a Turkish invasion of Cyprus in 1974. Around 40% of the island of Cyprus, a nation of Cyprus, fell under Turkish control and continues to be so to this day. Well, there we go. We don't talk about that. The first land grab by military force in Europe since 1945 is an anathema, since it would eviscerate the rules-based order that has underpinned peace on the continent for generations. Crimea and future NATO membership aspirations are red lines for us. We can't give them up, said a second senior EU diplomat. So Ukraine must be able to join NATO. In fact, it must eventually join NATO, and it must retake possession of all of its land, Crimea included. And that apparently continues to be the European position. In other words, it's not just the Ukrainians and the Russians who are rejecting the Kellogg plan. It is the Europeans also. The United States' own NATO allies are saying that they won't accept the Kellogg plan. Now, I have to say, I'm absolutely stunned by this. I am incredulous. The Europeans are saying that they won't accept the Kellogg plan. I can understand why Zelensky won't accept the Kellogg plan. After all, if the Kellogg plan were implemented in any form, there would have to be elections in Ukraine, which he would almost certainly lose. He would be out of power, and he would face all the risks and vulnerabilities that go with that. But the Europeans? What is their alternative to the Kellogg plan? What exactly are they proposing in place of the Kellogg plan? They're not coming up with any peace proposal of their own. They're not coming up with any suggestion, any proposal which could be taken and placed before the Russians, and which the Russians would accept. In fact, they're not coming up with any proposal of any kind whatsoever. There was some talk a few weeks ago when the Americans and the Russians began their preliminary discussions of the Europeans proposing their own peace plan, but as happened with the suggestion of appointing a European High Representative to conduct dialogue on Europe's behalf with Russia, we have heard no more about that. And, well, all right, there's not going to be a peace plan, a European peace plan, and they're rejecting Kellogg's peace plan, and they have no alternative ideas about how to achieve peace. But what exactly in that case are they proposing? What are they saying should be done? What is their way forward in terms of this particular crisis? And I say that, of course, we're talking about the EU, but I've also been reading in the Financial Times that the NATO Secretary General, Mark Rutte, is now also apparently in Washington, and he's going to meet with Trump administration officials, and he also is going to tell Trump administration officials not to try to force Ukraine to accept the Kellogg plan. In other words, he's telling Trump administration officials to scrap the Kellogg plan. But again, what exactly is it in that case that he suggests that America, the West, the collective West, actually do? Well, it's impossible to see. If you're not prepared to make peace, it's impossible to see that you have any other choice other than to continue the war. To continue the war in exactly the same way that it has been continued over the last 3 years. So the Russians advance, the Americans and the Europeans send more and more weapons to Ukraine. They take charge of military planning in Ukraine. They look for ways to escalate against Russia. They crank up sanctions constantly against Russia. They do, in other words, more of the same. The whole policy followed for the first 3 years of the war by Joe Biden is what the Europeans apparently want to see indefinitely continued. Now, this is extraordinary. This is unreal. It suggests an inability to address the realities that even for European leaders I find remarkable. Because, well, that would be a viable strategy if Ukraine and the collective West were actually winning the war in Ukraine. But no, they're not winning the war in Ukraine. They are losing the war in Ukraine. Now, to get a clear understanding of where we are, let me go to someone who has a much, much better understanding of the realities than, it seems, the entire collective leadership of the European Union and of NATO. And that, of course, is David Sachs, American entrepreneur, friend of many people, apparently Elon Musk himself, person who has been kind enough to do programs with us on the Duran. And anyway, he has published a post about Rubio and Witkoff walking away from that collapsed meeting on Wednesday, which to me, again, is a shining example of good sense. This is what he says: Crimea should be the easiest concession for Zelensky to make because, one, it has been part of Russia for the last decade. Two, the vast majority of its population are ethnic Russians who, as Western polling shows, want to be part of Russia. Three, Ukraine has no military way to retake it. The disastrous summer counteroffensive of 2023 made that abundantly clear. If Zelensky won't concede this, he won't concede anything. So a deal with him is impossible. The Secretary of State is right to walk away. What David Sachs might not have realized when he wrote that extremely astute comment is that it looks as if that a deal with the Europeans is impossible as well. Now let's go back to the point that David Sachs makes about Crimea. Ukraine has no military way to retake it. The disastrous summer counteroffensive of 2023 made that abundantly clear. That is absolutely true. That is completely right. I would add that what we now know from that article in the New York Times is that the summer 2023 offensive was actually the second attempt by Ukraine and its Western allies to recapture Crimea. The first one was the so-called Kherson offensive of the autumn of 2022, which was supposed to result in the complete defeat of the Russian army west of the Dnieper River, defending Kherson city, and then supposedly the Ukrainian army would cross the Dnieper and march on Crimea and recapture it, which of course never happened. And by the way, the summer 2023 counteroffensive had a dreadful, grisly epilogue, in that after its failure, a third attempt was made to advance on Crimea, with another attempt by the Ukrainian army to cross the Dnieper and to advance on Crimea, one which came to disaster, a grisly, horrible disaster, when the Ukrainian troops were trapped in the village of Krinky. So there it is. There is no military victory to be won in this war. It cannot be done. Now, it's not just that the West, ever since the failure of the summer 2023 and Krinky offensives, has had no actual plan to win the war. There is no roadmap towards winning this war in Ukraine, towards achieving any of these objectives, to retaking the four territories, to recapturing Crimea, to doing any of these things. But the reality is not that Ukraine is not winning the war. The reality is that the Russians are winning it, and Ukraine, and by extension the collective West, are losing it. Now, again, this has been the subject of an enormous amount of obfuscation and misrepresentation, some of which unfortunately appears to be influencing Donald Trump himself. The idea that the Russians are taking enormous losses, the idea that their economy is in dire straits, the idea that they can't sustain this offensive that they've been undertaking since October 2023 for much longer. None of these claims are true. Every single day, the Russians take more ground in Ukraine. More and more of the territory of the four regions is falling under Russian control every single day. This advance may not appear particularly rapid to some, but it is incremental, and it is gaining momentum, and it is bringing the Russians up against what is probably, well, certainly in Donbass, Ukraine's last line of defense, the cities of Slavyansk, Kramatorsk and Konstantinovka, and the town of Pokrovsk. And all of these cities now are vulnerable to Russian attack, and probably will be the subject of Russian attack over the course of this year. More likely than not, all four of these cities will have fallen to the Russians over the course of this year. So, when understood in this way, the whole unreality of the European position becomes starkly obvious, because the strategy that they seem to want to fall back on, which is the Biden, Sullivan, Blinken strategy of going on to send more and more weapons to Ukraine, going on to supply Ukraine with more intelligence and more assistance, conducting missile strikes against Russia, doing all of those things, is not working. It is failing. It is a strategy that is going to result ultimately in Ukraine's defeat. Now, in that same True Social post, which Trump has made, which I have criticized, Trump at least makes that very point. He makes the point that Ukraine has suffered terrible losses over the last 3 years, but that if Zelensky continues to maintain the stance that he is maintaining now, he will lose his entire country, or could lose his entire country, over the next 3 years. And that is absolutely right. In any war, it is almost axiomatic. It really should not need to be explained. But in any war, the final terms are going to favour the winner over the loser. It is the winner who will dictate the terms, and it is the loser who must accept them. By definition, this is so. Now, if we come back to that, and we look at the Kellogg plan, which is causing the Ukrainians and the Europeans so much trouble, then we can see immediately what the real problems with the Kellogg plan are. The real problems are not that it goes too far in favouring the position of the Russians, who are winning. It is that it doesn't go far enough. If the Russians are saying that the Kellogg plan is unacceptable to them because it leaves territory that they will eventually capture still under Ukrainian control, if it makes clear that Ukraine's membership of NATO really is not a topic even for consideration, then unless you want to see a complete military defeat in Ukraine, for Ukraine, and by extension for Europe and for the collective West, then you look for ways to satisfy those Russian conditions in a way that will not compromise or do further damage to Western security. And that means ceding the four regions, the entirety of the four regions, to Russia, accepting that Ukraine cannot become a member of NATO. The point about your red lines is that the war has erased them. You cannot insist on enforcement of red lines after a war that you're about to lose, and certainly you cannot do that after the war has been actually lost. That ought to be obvious. So if you are losing the war, which you are, the priority should be to try to stop the Russian army from advancing further beyond the territory of the four regions to positions where the whole future of Ukraine as an independent country might indeed be put at risk. Now, one person who has grasped this is Ukraine's former spin doctor-in-chief, former associate of Zelensky, now in bitter disagreement with him, and I understand in exile, perhaps in New York. And that is, of course, Alexei Arestovich. He has put it very simply, if you are not prepared to give up the four regions now, then prepare yourself for the prospect that you're going to have to give up 4 more regions, 8 regions in total, later. Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister, put it that way also, and he's done so on several occasions. He said that every time Ukraine reneges on an agreement or walks away from an agreement or stonewalls an agreement, its long-term position deteriorates. It loses more territory, more population, more economic assets than it would have done or would do if instead it faced the realities and compromised. Now, that's obviously true. I can understand why, as a result of the emotion and the anger that must exist in Ukraine, there are some people in Ukraine who struggle to understand and accept that. But that the same blindness would exist in European capitals, I have to say, at this point of the war, astonishes me. As Trump correctly says, sticking to this line will ultimately mean that in 3 years there will be no Ukraine left. That is what the Europeans apparently want to see, because there's no other explanation that I can see for what they're doing. They would rather sacrifice Ukraine than compromise with the Russians. And, well, there it is. Anyway, Trump apparently is paying little attention, for the moment at least, to any of this. Zelensky has rejected Kellogg's plan, the plan that Kellogg sold to Trump and told Trump would easily end the war. One of the, I have to say this, I mean, I don't like to use this word, but one of the most pathetic moments for me over the last 24 hours was a comment that Trump made impromptu, in which he said that he has found Zelensky much more difficult to work with than he'd ever expected. Well, all I can say about that is, again, had he spent any time actually observing the realities of the conflict, if he'd spent any time listening to Zelensky and informing himself about the political realities of Ukraine, nothing about Zelensky's intransigence or boorishness or refusal to accept reality would have surprised him. But anyway, there it is. He says that he's found Zelensky much more difficult to work with than he imagined. He says that by contrast, he's found Putin easier to work with than he has found Zelensky. But he still seems to cling on to the idea that somehow or other, in some unknown way or other, someone somewhere will give the Europeans apparently backing Zelensky against him, the Russians, as I said, reinforcing their stance as they have been doing over the last 24 hours. Apparently, Trump still clings to the hope that something somehow can be retrieved. If he continues along this path, I'm going to say it, he risks appearing on the international stage weak and even ridiculous. People will start to say that he is all bluff, that he says he's going to do something, but then whenever objections start to be made, he immediately retreats. And I don't think that is a position that Donald Trump wants to find himself in. Just saying. Anyway, there it is. That's the state of the negotiations at the moment. Now, there is something further that I do need to say, and it's a point that's been made very eloquently and very powerfully by my colleague and friend, Alex Christoforou, which is that one of the most bizarre aspects of the Kellogg plan is that it makes concessions to the Russians, or purports to concede to the Russians, demands that in fact the Russians have never made. The whole topic of recognizing Crimea as part of Russia is actually an absolutely bizarre one, because up to this point, the Russians have never demanded that the United States recognize Crimea as part of Russia. I've no doubt that if there ever was a final settlement, the Russians would prefer that. But the official Russian position was and continues to be that Crimea is a part of Russia and will remain so, and that this is not a subject for discussion, and whether the Western powers want to acknowledge that fact or not, it's a matter for them, given the opinions of the people in Crimea. In Crimea and across the four regions, it makes no difference. By the way, and for the record, the same will apply if the war continues when the Russians reach Odessa. If Odessa comes under Russian control, if Kharkiv comes under Russian control, but especially if Odessa comes under Russian control, given the importance of this city, not just in strategic and economic terms, but also in terms of Russian culture and identity and emotion, there is absolutely no way that the Russians will ever give it away again. That is something that needs to be understood at the outset. If you want to prevent Odessa becoming a part of Russia again, if that is your priority, then the time to prevent it is by coming to some kind of a deal on other questions with the Russians now, because if the Russians reach Odessa, there is no deal you can ever offer them. No deal at all, ever, which will ever persuade them to leave it again. I think that's the next point I want to make. But it's absolutely true. The Russians have not demanded at this point, as part of any negotiation, that Crimea should be recognized as Russian by the United States or by anyone else. The idea that the Russians would be prepared to trade territory in the four regions for American recognition of Crimea as Russian is, again, only an idea that only someone like Kellogg could have come up with. The second point, the second concession, which the Russians have never demanded, is that the United States, as part of this agreement, lift sanctions upon them. Apparently there's been a lot of discussion about lifting sanctions. This has been discussed extensively in the United States. There was an article today in Politico, by the way, in which claimed that Steve Witkoff wants to move forward expeditiously with lifting sanctions on Nord Stream and on Russian energy. Rubio supposedly was opposed. Almost immediately, Witkoff and Rubio came out and said that this was completely untrue, that there's no discussion about lifting sanctions on Russia, and that this is all fake news, and that Politico is an unreliable magazine. Well, I don't know what the realities are. But anyway, there has indeed been discussions of this. There is no doubt, because it is apparently in the Kellogg plan, of at least some level of sanctions relief being offered to Russia if it were to accept the Kellogg plan. But the Russians have not actually asked for sanctions relief as part of a settlement. Again, if anybody in the administration had taken the trouble to read Putin's speech to the Russian industrialists of the 18th of March, just a few weeks ago, last month, they would see that Putin told the industrialists that he expects sanctions to remain in place permanently. He doesn't expect the sanctions to be lifted ever. He said that Russia has always lived under sanctions, even when sanctions had been supposedly lifted after the end of the Cold War. The Jackson-Vanik Amendment in practice remained in place. When the Jackson-Vanik Amendment was finally annulled, cancelled, it was immediately replaced by something analogous, which was the Magnitsky Act. So there will always be sanctions against Russia. Russia's future is to accept that reality and to work to develop its economy in the reality of permanent sanctions. And clearly, with the Russians in that frame of mind, and there's no reason to doubt that this is what Putin actually believes, there is no point in trying to persuade the Russians to make concessions in return for sanctions relief, substantive sanctions relief, because the Russians don't believe it will ever happen. It actually goes beyond this, because in that same speech to the industrialists and in other speeches made by other officials of the Russian government to the Russian business community, those officials and Putin himself have had to go out of their way to reassure the business community and the industrialists that if sanctions are relaxed in any way, this will not undermine the position of Russian businesses and Russian industries that have taken advantage of the sanctions to capture important positions previously occupied in the Russian economy by Western companies. So there is no great support for lifting sanctions from the business community within Russia itself. Some oligarchs, some members of the financial sector probably would like the sanctions lifted, but they are people who in Russia were powerful 20 years ago, but whose power has since declined and which continues to decline by the day. So again, Kellogg, apparently not fully familiar with the realities, Russian realities, is offering the Russians a concession they have not asked for, and probably in the way that he frames it, do not even especially want. They would like economic cooperation with the United States, especially in the energy sector, but it would be economic cooperation on their terms with the objective of maintaining a balance of oil and energy prices. And in that position, by the way, they are backed by the Saudis as well, who have been telling the Americans exactly the same thing. So there it is. As I said, completely unreal discussion. And I have to say, I am at once bewildered and frustrated that the President of the United States cannot see this, cannot see that the Europeans and the Ukrainians and indeed the Russians are all rejecting the plan that he has committed himself to. To go back to what Professor Mearsheimer says, the gap between what the Ukrainians will accept and what the Russians will accept is unbridgeable. There is no compromise that can cover it. Trump may indeed, as he says, be distressed about the number of people who are dying on the battlefields, the Ukrainian battlefields, every day. But ultimately, that is the reality of war. When wars begin, they are very often very, very difficult to start, to end, despite the fact that all of these people die in them. And in fact, the greater the number of deaths, the more intractable, in my experience and in historical experience, wars tend to become, and the more likely it is, in fact, that the outcome of the war will be decided through a military victory. So there we go. Now, Witkoff is going to Moscow. I suspect that when he meets with Putin tomorrow, Putin will say to him what I discussed in my program yesterday. He will say to Witkoff, look, forget about this Kellogg plan. He won't say it quite in that way, but he says, forget about it. The Ukrainians are not going to accept it. Zelensky has made that perfectly clear. Your European allies are not accepting it. They have made that also perfectly clear. That is to say, Russia and the United States have a great deal to talk about and discuss and agree with each other. We are making great progress, for example, on the subject of the Iran nuclear negotiations. You have been speaking to Arakchi, you, Witkoff, have been speaking to Arakchi. You've come to some common ground. We have met with Arakchi. We're coming up with all kinds of ideas whereby we can move forward with this initiative. We can provide guarantees to the Iranians, secure guarantees to protect them against a future attack. They will in return, promise to give up their nuclear enrichment program to the point where it seriously threatens to escalate into a nuclear device. And Putin can also tell Witkoff, I've also had a massive meeting yesterday with none other than the Sultan of Oman, the mediator in the discussions between yourself and the Iranians. He came to Moscow with a strong delegation. I spent a long time speaking to him in the Kremlin. The Russian readout, the Kremlin readout of the discussion, makes no reference at all, by the way, to the nuclear talks between the United States and Iran, which the Omanis are mediating. But there is no doubt at all that in reality, the Sultan and Putin will have had a lot to say to each other about all of this. So all of the pieces are now starting to fall into place to get this Iran deal sorted over the next few weeks and months. Do you really want to jeopardize all of that? Do you really want to jeopardize the future of our own relationship, which can be so beneficial for each of us in terms of developing oil fields in the Arctic, balancing the energy market, allowing a return to Russia of some of your companies? Do you really want to put all that at risk by letting someone like Zelensky and his European allies disrupt the improvement in relations between us? And if Putin wants to take this even further, though I personally doubt that he will do so, he can also point out to Witkoff that in reality the entire European position is a complete bluff anyway, because the Europeans may be saying that if there is a split between the United States and Ukraine, they will back Ukraine against the United States. And that might indeed be what people like Macron and Starmer and Merz and Ursula von der Leyen and Kaja Kallas and all of those people think and believe. But the reality is that Europe, the united front that the Europeans have, will fracture almost immediately. If the United States starts to relax at least some of the sanctions against Russia, it is inconceivable that some other European states will not insist on the EU doing the same thing. So if the United States lifts sanctions on Nord Stream, by the way, just to say, pressure in Germany to restart Nord Stream in some form will grow. The German business community is already calling for it. The minister-presidents, the Christian Democrat minister-presidents of Saxony and Thuringia have also demanded it. Other countries that want to re-establish economic relations with Russia include Italy, whose Giorgia Meloni is increasingly distancing herself from the European leadership on the whole question of Ukraine, and who has now visited the United States, where she appears to have had a very friendly meeting with Donald Trump. And more likely than not, the Hungarians and the Slovaks, perhaps with the backing of the Italians and others, will start to veto any further rollover of sanctions, which have to be renewed by the EU every 6 months, something which requires unanimity on the part of EU states. If the United States starts to lift some of its sanctions or relax some of its sanctions against Russia. So I suspect that Putin will say some or even all of these things. I'm not sure exactly, obviously, what he's going to say. And he will probably say to Witkoff, tell Trump that we in Russia hugely appreciate all that Trump has been trying to do, but as should be obvious by now, as we ourselves discovered long ago, these people in Kiev and their backers in Europe are not reasonable. They're not to be trusted. They will simply carry on with the same policy, and they will try to draw you back to the position that Joe Biden had, which Trump campaigned against in the election, and which was rejected by the American people when they voted for Donald Trump. So that is the kind of discussion that I expect to take place when Witkoff and Putin meet, presumably in the Kremlin tomorrow. Anyway, we will see what Donald Trump does. In the meantime, the conflict obviously goes on. There was this massive combined missile and drone strike on Ukraine that took place yesterday. The Ukrainians said it was the biggest Russian drone and missile strike for a long time. They claimed around 70 missiles were used and around 150 drones, presumably Geranium-2 and maybe some of these new Geranium-3 drones. The epicenter of the attack was Kiev. The Ukrainians claimed that they shot down around half the drones and missiles. This is significantly less than what they used to claim, and probably, in fact, many more missiles and drones have got through. Though it's important to say that Kiev continues to be the most heavily protected of all Ukrainian cities from drone and missile strikes. But anyway, it's clear that a lot of drones and a lot of missiles did get through. The Russian Defense Ministry claims that most of the targets were component parts of the military industrial system, such as it is in Ukraine today. And the Russian Defense Ministry also says that railway connections to Kiev, the ones, by the way, used by Western leaders, presumably when they travelled to Kiev, those were attacked also. Now, I'm not going to go into the details of the fighting on the battlefronts, but it's clear to me that especially in the Konstantinovka area and around Pokrovsk, the Russians continue to advance. Around Pokrovsk, incrementally, in the Konstantinovka area, rapidly, and that the build-up of Russian forces in northern Ukraine continues as well. As I said, the Russians have been on the attack for the last couple of weeks, about 2 weeks now. They've made actually significant gains, but apparently the ground is still wet, and it's likely that the big blow will come in May, or at least so it looks to me. Not a single day passes any longer where the Russians don't announce the capture of some village or settlement in some place, sometimes more than one. And if people remember earlier stretches of the war, it was quite common for months to pass before the Russians announced the capture of any location in Ukraine at all. Well, that hasn't been the case recently. So anyway, there we go. Now, what Donald Trump does over the next few days or weeks, of course, remains up to him. His latest posts on Truth Social suggests that there continues to be division within the administration, an argument about the way forward, that Kellogg hasn't given up with his plan, and Trump is unable for the moment to give up on it either. I hope that reality will eventually dawn and that Trump will finally act on what he's threatened to do, which is walk away. He can then, or he should then, move forward with at least some kind of re-engagement, proper re-engagement with the Russians. He appears to be making his first steps towards de-escalating the tariff crisis with China. He made comments yesterday about the fact that the tariffs were unsustainably high, the point I've been making program after program for the last 2 weeks, and that they need to be brought down, though never to nothing or to where they were before, which, by the way, I completely understand. As I said, a 10% tariff, flat tariff on all countries, with higher tariffs to protect certain American industries. That seems to me to be a viable political position and perhaps a viable economic strategy also. The Chinese are taking a very, very tough line. The Financial Times is saying that they're telling Trump that they're not prepared to begin any kind of discussions until the tariffs are brought down to where they were before he started to raise them. I think that is, by the way, more likely to be a negotiating position than anything else. If the tariffs are brought down to, say, 20%, I think the Chinese probably at that point will feel that the point has been made and that they will begin discussions. But anyway, he's shown that he does understand the realities. He understands the realities about the direction of the war. He cannot presumably want to go back and become Joe Biden with respect to the conflict in Ukraine, which is what the Ukrainians and the Europeans ultimately want him to do. And besides, as he himself realizes, that is a losing proposition anyway. So the time has come for him to tell the Europeans, the Ukrainians, the Russians also, enough's enough. We've done all we can. We're moving on. Nobody likes our plan. Nobody's accepting it. In light of this, there's nothing further for us to do. We're ending our involvement in this affair. And in the meantime, we're going to start acting in our own interests. And those include reopening dialogue with Russia. Well, that's where I end today's program. More from me soon. Let me remind you again, you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble and X. You can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar and by going to our shop. Don't forget also to, if you've liked this video, to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.